Lily, thanks very much. Well, the Conservative MP, Charlotte Leslie, is a member of the All-Party Health Select Committee in the House of Commons, and she's in our Bristol studio. Miss Leslie, afternoon to you.
Afternoon.
Do you share that assessment of the position of David Pryor and David Behan?
I think they made a massive error of judgment in not aggressively revealing those names. And I also want to ask the question, who is leaning on them to do that? Because I think what worries me about this whole saga is that the Morecambe Bay horrors and the Mid-Staffs horrors are actually symptoms of a far deeper and almost more sinister mafia-like network at the centre of the NHS.
That's quite a strong allegation to make.
It is a very strong allegation to make, but if you look at the kind of things that have been going on, a year ago we wouldn't have believed this would happen, but unfortunately we've learnt that the unbelievable does happen. There are relationships here that need some scrutiny. Cynthia Bauer went on to a promotion to be head of the CQC from being at Mid-Staffs. She was a successor to David Nicholson, who went on to a promotion to be chief executive and now has got another promotion to chief executive of NHS England. How are these appointments made? What are the late relationships between them? Given that Cynthia Bauer and David Nicholson would have been close and she was running the CQC and Nicholson's job was to make the NHS look good for ministers and government, what was going on there?
And it raises a question, of course, of ministerial leadership too. I mean, Roy Lilly was saying there that he thinks that it's down to Jeremy Hunt now to show Mr Pryor and Mr Behan the door. Do you think that they should go?
I think that we need to have a very careful look at whether the CQC is actually the body. And I think Mr Lilly is absolutely right. This goes back a long way. Back in the early 2000s, the Labour government didn't trust professionals. Back then, it was the medical royal colleges, medics who knew what they were talking about, who did the inspections. Now, unfortunately for the government, this came up with some unpleasant truths at a time when a lot of reforms were taking place, and the Labour government needs to present the NHS as this icon where everything was rosy, and these unpleasant truths didn't fit in. So they replaced it with something called the PMET-B, which was essentially supposed to be an independent body, but guess what? Out of the 21 members, 16 were appointed by the government, which didn't do the same kind of inspection regimes, didn't do the in-depth inquiry that this body did, and everything seemed much rosier. The CQC was built on top of that, and it's further removing the truth from the political narrative. And so it's a legacy of appearance mattering more than reality up until the last government that we're now dealing with.
Ultimately, though, it is a responsibility for this government. Do you think that David Behan and David Pryor are the right people to restore confidence in the system of regulation in the context of what you've just been saying about the failures of that system?
I have to say, I think an Ofsted-style regulation, I think Jeremy Hunt's doing exactly the right thing in putting transparency and accountability at the heart of the NHS, but it will only work if it's the doctors and the clinicians, and as Mr Lilly is right and says, the GPs as well as the other medical royal colleges who are doing the inspecting. If you have a government organisation doing the inspecting, when it's the government that provides the NHS, it's always going to go wrong. And I think we need a very full inquiry into the network relationships between senior Department of Health officials, ministers and managers, because it all looks far too cosy. And I'm worried that we're going to see a series of these horror stories emerge and are not going to get to the bottom of the issue.
And what then do you think of the position of Mr Behan and Mr Pryor in that context?
Well, I mean, I think you'd have to look. My question is who was doing the leaning on them to lead them to a really counterintuitive judgment?
But should they allow themselves to be lent on?
Well, I mean, this is it. Should people allow themselves to be lent on? I think it was a grave error of judgment. I think you need also to look at the whole network, though. You can't look at these things in isolation. Otherwise, you just remove extraneous parts of the problem. The problem lies in relationships and a stitch-up, in a sense, at the centre of the NHS. And the more you look at this, the more questions aren't answered. And I think people are sick of senior officials like David Nicholson and Cynthia Bauer having a mysterious lack of recollection about absolutely everything. That asks its own questions in itself.
Charlotte Leslie, Conservative member of the Health Select Committee, thank you very much.